tonight. Reaction after the Vatican releases a statement saying its centuries-old Doctrine of Discovery does not adequately reflect the equal dignity and rights of Indigenous peoples. Also, the provincial government introduces legislation to license physician assistants in Saskatchewan. Plus, studying the science of belching bovines, how agriculture in our province is finding ways to cut back on methane emissions.
This is CBC Saskatchewan News.
It is Thursday, March 30th, and the CBC Saskatchewan News starts right now. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. In a move that has been decades in the making, the Vatican says it is repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery. It is based on 15th century papal decrees that have been used to justify colonization. Indigenous peoples have spent years urging the Catholic Church to rescind the doctrine. Olivia Stefanovic reports.
The call was made loud and clear, but there was no immediate answer. Now, 8 months after Pope Francis visited Canada, the Roman Catholic Church signaling a new direction is needed. The Vatican distancing itself from the Doctrine of Discovery, an instrument of oppression used to dispossess Indigenous peoples.
I was pleased and relieved. Because we have been waiting for such a long time for this to come to pass.
The move comes as Pope Francis battles a respiratory infection in hospital. Exactly 1 year after First Nations, Inuit, and Métis delegates met the Pope at the Vatican. It also follows decades of advocacy from residential school survivors and Indigenous leaders like Phil Fontaine.
We can quibble over words, right? This is missing or that's missing. It's a pretty profound statement.
The Vatican statement is deliberate. It uses the word repudiate instead of rescind or reject.
I think it's clear that this is a small step along the way.
This Canadian Archbishop worked with the Vatican to craft the language.
It's a step, though, right? I mean, where we want to go is to a place where we have right relations, where Indigenous peoples are not at all marginalized in society.
Today is a positive step. It is much more than the religious revocation of a doctrine.
The Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations says it will have ripple effects across the country.
If we are truly on a path and on a plane of equals, what do we do to embody our relationship going forward?
Archbishop Boland says the answer is to replace the old doctrine with a new one, based on solidarity with Indigenous peoples. Olivia Stefanovic, CBC News, Ottawa.
In Saskatchewan, the reaction is a resounding finally. First Nations peoples and groups in the province see the Vatican's move as a step toward reconciliation, as long as that step forward is followed by tangible action. Dean Patterson has the latest.
The Vatican's message is reverberating here in Saskatchewan for First Nations groups and people.
It's a welcomed repudiation. It's been requested. It's been called for. It's taken a long time.
Still, the doctrine's effects remain.
Trauma, grief, drug use, poverty, addictions. Those are all the consequential harms of colonization and the effects that residential schools have had, that oppressive policies have had.
For some, the statement is triggering, a reminder of the trauma caused by the doctrine. So while some find accountability and closure in the Church's statement, others do not.
How do you retract genocide?
In Saskatchewan, the focus is on the people, but also on the land and what happens to it now. Indigenous groups have taken issue with the Saskatchewan First Act and the ongoing Crown land sales. Those are both top of mind.
How can we fix it? And you're going to find the best solutions from each First Nation, Chief and Council, their band members, and the survivors. That's where the best solutions are.
Cameron says it provides some closure after decades of work, but that's just some of the work that needs to be done in consultation with First Nations groups. It also legitimizes the issues First Nation groups have had with land ownership.
So it could be more than symbolic. It depends on the interpretation that the courts use and the arguments that are made.
Pontiff's repudiation of the doctrine is among the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. The 49th call asked faith groups to repudiate concepts that justified colonization of Indigenous lands, but it's unclear what impact this repudiation will have on the ground in Saskatchewan. Dane Patterson, CBC News, Saskatoon.
As Dane mentioned, the issue of land rights is top of mind for many First Nations people in this province, especially when it comes to revenue sharing agreements and the province's newly announced rare mineral strategy. Will McClernon has that story.
Earlier this week, Saskatchewan's government announced its 10-year plan to increase rare mineral production by 2030. 23 of 31 of the so-called critical minerals featured on Canada's critical mineral list are found in Saskatchewan. But the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations says the province's strategy infringes on First Nations treaty and inherent rights. It says First Nations need to be included in planning and in sharing the revenues generated through rare mineral productions, because First Nations are the rightful owners of those resources, not the settlers.
They made agreements that they would be farming, for agriculture. So that was the discussions at the time of treaty. So that's why we say we agreed to the depth of a plow, and minerals, oil and gas and so forth were never on the table.
That agreement, though, was never actually put on paper in treaty agreements, which could complicate First Nations claims to natural resources.
There's a pretty wide difference in the viewpoints of the government and the First Nations on that issue, as between all of the minerals having been transferred under the treaties versus none of the minerals having been transferred under the treaties. It's a pretty stark difference and a very large legal dispute if that were ever tested out in full.
Newman says he thinks FSIN is putting forward a large claim to the minerals to start negotiating with the province, as a way to start discussing resource revenue sharing agreements with Saskatchewan's government. Those exist in other provinces already, and exist in a way already in Saskatchewan, through gaming agreements between the Saskatchewan Indian Gaming Association and the province.
We need substantial resources. Federal and provincial policies aren't fixing that.
Saskatchewan's premier says resource revenue is shared with everyone in the province, and says the province is engaging with Indigenous-owned companies and First Nations people work in resource extraction industries. Will McClernon, CBC News.
The Saskatchewan government introduced legislation this afternoon to license physician assistants in the province. The initiative was announced in last week's budget and will cost $1.7 million annually. It will create 12 new positions within the health system. Physician assistants practice medicine under the supervision of licensed doctors. Some of their duties include conducting patient examinations, prescribing medications, and ordering and interpreting tests. They are already licensed to work in other provinces like Ontario and Manitoba. Saskatchewan's health minister says they will help the government's efforts to increase access to primary care.
This is another tool that we're going to be able to have to help out our healthcare system. And this is directly into the primary care. Physician assistants are like an army medic. They can triage, they can discharge patients. We've been able to work with the College of Medicine on this. They introduced or proposed it to me about a year ago. We were able to work with them to get some bylaws predated so they can act on it right away.
Merriman says if the opposition supports the legislation, it can pass in the next few days and the job postings will go up. The opposition health critic says they will take a look at the legislation before deciding how to vote. The final report into the 2020 mass shooting in Nova Scotia that left 22 people dead was released today. The Mass Casualty Commission slams the RCMP for widespread failures in their response to Canada's deadliest mass shooting. And it makes 130 recommendations calling for fundamental changes in policing across the country. Blair Rhodes has the details.
Commission Chair Michael McDonald says it was not their role to assign blame.
However, we do not shy away from declaring hard truths and accountability. We identify them precisely so we can learn from them and do better.
One of those hard truths was the confusion surrounding RCMP operations that weekend. The Commission says there was no clear command structure and that officers in the field weren't sure who they should be dealing with. The Mounties were also ill-prepared for what they were dealing with. The Commission found that RCMP policies on crisis like this were out of date and their training was inadequate. They trained for a static situation in a building, not a gunman driving around shooting people at random and leaving fires in his wake. While their internal communications were flawed, their communications with the public were even worse. One vague tweet on the night of the 18th and nothing more until the next morning. And a delay in telling people that the gunman was driving a replica RCMP cruiser. McDonald was asked whether he believes the RCMP understands the need for change.
I can say it no better than Officer Campbell on the stand when he apologized for failing and saying he would do better.
I apologize for failing.
He, in a very heartfelt way, said to the world that we failed you and we'll do better. And he's a high-ranking RCMP member.
But Campbell is gone, transferred to New Brunswick. The same is true of every other senior Mountie who is in charge in April of 2020, up to and including Commissioner Brenda Luckie. They've all either retired or been transferred. Her replacement offered an apology of sorts.
I'm deeply sorry for the unimaginable pain and suffering.
But Duhaime stopped short of apologizing for what the Mounties did that weekend, saying they did the best they could with what they had. Duhaime says he needs more time to study the Commission's recommendations, but he's committing the RCMP to making the necessary changes. Michael McDonald says he's optimistic that his Commission's report won't join others gathering dust on a government shelf somewhere. He says that's because he expects stakeholders, including the families of the 22 victims, to hold people's feet to the fire to make sure that this time something is done. Blair Rhodes, CBC News, Truro.
One of the recommendations from the Mass Casualty Commission is to phase out the current model of RCMP training. All Mounties are required to go through 26 weeks of training at Depot in Regina. But the report recommends ending that by 2032 and creating regional training centres. It also recommends developing a 3-year training program for police education for police nationwide. That's something politicians here find concerning.
Big deal in those jobs. That tradition matters to this city, matters to this province, and I'd like to see all levels of government work together to express those concerns and look for solutions to not lose Depot here from Regina.
Premier Scott Moe says he wants to take a closer look at the report before making too many judgments. Still, he says the government is a big supporter of Depot and training RCMP officers in this province. We're learning more about how the Regina Police Service's new aerial support unit is doing. The police plane took off on its first call in late January. It's been in the air for about 8 hours every shift since.
Just to see the success that we're having on the ground in just even locating one missing person or one vulnerable person who wandered from their home, holding that suspect accountable who's stolen the car, getting the stolen vehicle back to the rightful owner in a timely fashion, undamaged. All of these things are very positive for our community, and also just increasing the public safety and the officer safety that comes along with it has been very good.
Over the last 2 months, Regina Police say the aerial support unit has helped with nearly 500 calls. Out of those, about 100 arrests have been made, with roughly 130 charges laid. You can't really tell by all the snow out there. It might be really snowy for March 30th, but it was actually a great day to be outside. You can tell that these dogs really love their freedom and that their owners didn't have to suffer for it. We're rolling toward what looks like a nice weekend. Heather Morrison will have your forecast after the break. Stay with us. Ottawa is considering restoring funding to the country's largest sports organization. The government cut Hockey Canada's funding 9 months ago after a scandal involving payments linked to a sexual assault complaints. The federal sports minister demanded proof that government funding was not used for the alleged payments and access to the investigation into the incident. Hockey Canada says it has now provided all the information. A criminal investigation into the alleged incident continues.
This weather update is brought to you by Mercedes-Benz Regina, part of the Capital Automotive Group.
And Heather Morrison joins me now with a look at your forecast. And dare I say, even though it's not, the weather we're supposed to have, it was nice out today. We're seeing incremental improvement.
We will, and that improvement is going to continue into the weekend. Let's take a look at what's happening in the upper atmosphere, because that's really the cause of what's going on. So you can see that dark blue line that's running from the northwest corner down until about middle of the province there on the east side. So that is where we're sitting. That warm, lighter blue is what moved into the province over the past couple of days, but you can see how it kind of cuts down on an angle, and that's why we're seeing slightly cooler temperatures on the eastern side of the province than we are seeing on the western half. But this is going to continue to move on, Sam, so we are going to warm up a couple degrees tomorrow, and then by Saturday we're going to be sitting very nicely. You can see the whole province is in that lighter blue, so we're going to get a real warm up for Saturday, and that's when we're going to get closer to normal. When you say this isn't the weather we're supposed to have, you are correct. We're about 5 or 6 degrees below normal for this time of year. So even though it's milder, it doesn't really feel like we're winning right now. So how is this going to affect the temperature for the next couple days? Well, lighter greens mean warmer temperatures. So this is tonight. It's going to cool off obviously overnight, and then nice tomorrow. We get a lot of greens coming in the province, but this is where we're going to see the difference Saturday night. Here you go into Saturday. Lots of those bright greens. If only we could just steal Calgary's weather. Wouldn't that be nice? All right, so we are waking up to, again, a bit of a chilly morning, but not as bad as that we were seeing at the earlier part of the week when we were waking up to those minus 35 wind chills. So here we go, minus 7 in Saskatoon for the morning, minus 9 in Regina. But just because we're having milder morning doesn't mean that it's going to warm up as much throughout the day. We're all going to get to about that freezing mark. Some places are going to finally pop over today. We're going to be about 2 degrees warmer tomorrow than we were today, but there is going to be that range, and as you can see, it's slightly colder along that eastern part of the province. So in terms of sky cover, so it's going to be mainly a mix of sun and cloud tomorrow, but overnight tonight you can see, and into tomorrow, we're going to have these scattered snow showers. So there's really just these scattered snow pockets, so not a significant amount of snowfall, but just these light dustings, and then they're going to move on through, and then we get a more significant amount of snow in the north, and that's coming in on Saturday. The big story really in the change of weather would be the wind. As you can see tomorrow, we're expecting it to be quite gusty. Look down at Maple Creek there in the bottom, in the southwest corner of the province. You can see 52 kilometer per hour wind. So it's going to be a lot gustier than it was in the beginning part of the week. So if we take a look at the 7-day temperature here for Regina, minus 2 on Friday, warms up a little bit on Saturday to plus 5. And in Saskatoon, the same thing. So we're not going to get quite as warm on Saturday in Saskatoon, and then we drop off and we're kind of hovering around that freezing mark for the rest of the week. So we do appreciate this mild weather, but as I said, Sam, we still are those few degrees below normal.
Oh, we're getting there, Heather. We're getting there.
We're going to do it.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hopeful gamblers from across the country are flocking to a tiny Ontario town with a big lottery and a possible record jackpot tonight. Hagersville's Catch the Ace lottery has hit a new record, a $1.6 million potential payout. More than 80,000 tickets were sold in a week in a town of just 3,000 people. Most of the money goes towards community groups. We'll be back after the break. When you think of methane emissions, it's easy to think about our oil and gas industry, but animals play a part in the overall picture too. In the second part of his series on Methane Solutions in our province, Ethan Williams heads into the field to see how the agricultural industry is making improvements.
Some of the food waste that ends up here begins its life here, in the farm fields of central Saskatchewan. And just like in a landfill, methane can be found in these fields. The province's oil and gas industry produces the most greenhouse gas emissions of any industry in the province, but close behind is the province's agricultural sector. And when it comes to methane specifically, cattle production plays a big role in that. But here in this field near Clavette, one University of Saskatchewan researcher is hoping to curb those emissions with a unique project.
We have
3 or 4 different species in here compared to our control.
Bart Lardner is a professor in the College of Agriculture at the U of S. This is his laboratory, and these cows are his test subjects. That's because cows produce methane. It forms in the rumen. That's a compartment of the cow's stomach that breaks down plant products. The cow then burps out the methane through its mouth and nose. But Lardner and his team think they can reduce these emissions. In this approximately 56-hectare field, the team is growing different combinations of crops. The challenge? Find out which combination produces the least amount of methane in a cow's rumen, while also providing the animal with high-quality food. Since 2018, they've worked through the seasons to find the right mix. So far, legumes, specifically alfalfa, look to be the best bet.
We're still collecting multiple years of data, but there's certainly anywhere from 2 to 5% lower levels of emissions coming from some of those different systems. And so, as I said, we'll look at a 4 or 5 or 6 years data to come up and walk away and make some solid implications.
But how exactly do you measure methane emissions from a cow? Well, Lardner and his team have 2 solutions. The first is what he calls a green feeder. Powered by solar energy, this device dispenses pellets of alfalfa. As the cow eats, the gases it breathes and belches out are trapped by the device, stored on a cloud system, and can be assessed. The other option is a bit more intrusive.
Once this is plugged in, it'll start sucking up the gases as the animal breathes, and they'll end up in this yoke.
A sort of mask strapped around the neck and face of the livestock. It sucks up the gases they emit, and after 24 hours, it's put into vials and shipped off for analysis. Caitlin Nielsen, the team's research technician, is responsible for fitting the sometimes boisterous bovines with this device.
Day one, they get a little bit upset about it. The steers in particular will come running out of the chute and throwing their heads and kind of playing around. But by day 2, they just kind of settle in, and that's how it goes.
The study still has a ways to go, but Lardner hopes to expand his research into the real world and reduce more than just methane.
We can take that data and we can talk to producer groups, we can talk to stakeholders, and we can say, you know what? If you think about changing your program or your cropping rotation, that's not only going to reduce enteric emissions from your herd as a whole, but it's also going to capture a lot of carbon.
While agriculture is working on solutions, there appear to be many outstanding issues when it comes to methane emissions in the oil and gas industry. So how are those involved in making decisions actively working to tackle those issues? We'll find out in the final part of our feature. Ethan Williams, CBC News, near Clavet.
And after all the side-eye from the cows, we are back with one last look at weather.
Yeah, they give me, well, it is a cold night in the province, but they can't blame me. Let's take a look at what's happening overnight in Regina. So I shouldn't call it a cold, let's call it a chilly night. As you can see, they're -8 with the wind chill -15. So waking up to -9, which really comparatively to what we've had so far is not that bad, but we should be doing better. Our low should be around -5 for this time of year. We warm up throughout the day. We are going to be a few degrees cooler than we were yesterday. So I think +5 is where we're going to get to in Regina. And then overnight, as you can see in Saskatoon, another sort of frosty morning is what I would call it. And then we're going to warm up throughout the day. We're not going to get as warm as Regina. We're heading to about +2 for the warm up there in Saskatoon. But we get a lot of sunshine. Regina's going to get the win. And there you go, Sam.
All right. Thanks, Heather.
You're welcome.
And that is it for us tonight. For news anytime, you can head to cbc.ca/Sask or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Glenn, Reed, and Heather will be back with more local news tonight at 11. Thanks for watching and have a great night.